Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Let's Talk Elephants. I'm your host, Destiny Farley, and today I'll be interviewing Madisen Silva, who is a teacher at a public charter high school here in Las Vegas. She has a degree in psychology from St. Mary's College of California and has her standard teaching license from the Nevada Department of Education. Currently, Madisen teaches a class at her school that is designed to teach kids how to set boundaries, regulate and identify their emotions, and maintain positive relationships. She also focuses on sex ed and will get a little bit into gender studies as well later on in the episode, and whether or not kids should be taught these things in school, along with what the appropriate role is for a teacher in a student's life. Basically, we're going to cover the extent to which teachers should have an influence on their students' personal lives and belief systems, and if that's something that is even controllable within the classroom setting. Before getting too far into the details of the episode, Madisen, can you please briefly introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your background and why you decided to become a teacher?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Madisen Silva, as Destiny mentioned. Growing up, I actually lived in the Bay Area. So until I was in second grade, I lived in the Bay Area. Then my mom was going to become a teacher. It was so much cheaper to live in Nevada. She had family out here, so we moved to Nevada. So from second grade onward to high school graduation, I lived in Henderson, Nevada. I went to a school that was one belief system, essentially. I went to Coronado High School, and there was a lack of diversity there. So growing up, I didn't really witness different cultural identities, and I wasn't faced with a lot of diverse backgrounds, which I feel is definitely a downfall. Growing up, if you only see one group of people and then you interact with them later on in the world, then it can definitely influence people's belief systems towards certain other groups. Luckily, I grew up with very liberal parents, so my upbringing was different than a lot of people that I was surrounded by, but I saw a lot of entitlement. So I graduated high school. I knew that I wanted to be back in California, and I transitioned to St. Mary's College, as Destiny mentioned. At St. Mary's, I studied psychology, so I've always been interested in why people behave the way that they do. So what in their upbringing, what in their childhood led them to behave a certain way socially or in relationships or just in their daily lives. So that was always fascinating to me. So I got my BS in psychology at St. Mary's, and then I transitioned into nonprofit work. So I started at the Boys and Girls Club, and I became a teen director at the Boys and Girls Club. I quickly saw different dynamics, and I was exposed to many different backgrounds that were different than my own, which I thought was such a gift. So working at the Boys and Girls Club, I, again, had different members that would come in, high school age students, and they were aged 12 to 18. So a lot of them went to the local high schools. And I remember distinctly, this was a light bulb moment for me. One of my members came up to me and they said, "Miss Silva," I asked how their day was, and they said, "Miss Silva, I had a teacher, and she was so clearly racist in the classroom." And he told me of his experience. And to me, I just completely flipped a switch in my brain, and I said, you know what, I need to do more. Why should a student ever have to experience something like that, a situation where they're not at fault at all? You know, they're born into something and they can't change it. It's an innate quality about them that makes them unique and makes them worthy. So I decided to pursue teaching. So I went to Teach for America. It's a summer institute program where you train and then you get your provisional teaching license, and then you're able to take classes. So they train you for half the day, and then you teach a summer school at a charter school as well. So from then on, I taught 8th grade English my first year. I taught at a school, public school in CCSD at North Las Vegas. And then I transitioned to Pinecrest Academy, where I also taught 6th grade English. And then I was there for 2 years. So I spent 2 years at Pinecrest Academy in Old Henderson. And then I finally transitioned to another public charter high school, where now I teach freshmen through senior, and I teach health and social emotional learning.
So I didn't know you went to Coronado. I went to Coronado too.
Yeah, I did.
Oh, did you know that I went to Coronado?
I didn't.
Okay, well, that's funny.
We were different years, probably.
Well, yeah, I think you're older than me.
Yes, I'm 29 years old.
Okay, I'm 24. So you were gone by the time I got there.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
You mentioned that you went to Catholic school, or like...
So I was raised Catholic. Yes,
Okay.
That was my upbringing. My dad's side was very Catholic, to the point where church every Sunday was a must. We were growing up getting confirmed, First Communion. I quickly realized that I felt, I don't want to say a different mindset than those members, but it was very guilt-ridden. It was filled with shame. I quickly realized it was do this or you need to repent. Do this or you're a sinner. And to me, I just didn't really agree with that mindset. And years down the road, I realized I believe in a higher power, but again, it's not tied to a constructed religion where if you don't follow this set of guidelines, then you're a bad person or you're doing it wrong.
Right. Yeah, I went to Catholic school from third grade to eighth grade.
Oh my goodness.
So that, that's a unique experience. I am not Catholic anymore. I'm not practicing. I did get confirmed. After I left Catholic school, I went to Coronado, obviously public high school, and then I went back and got confirmed more because it was just what you did. Like after having gone to Catholic school for so long, like that was the next step, and I just didn't really have strong beliefs at that point. I was just kind of going with the flow. I wasn't raised devoutly Catholic. I wouldn't say my family was like uber strict or anything like that. They did push church a lot. Like there was a point for a while where, I had to go to mass as a part of school, and then they would still make me go to mass on Sundays.
Oh,
as
wow.
we got older, like we had the choice to not go. But yeah, so like I see that there's a spectrum there. It's interesting though that you say that your parents were liberal.
They were.
But they were Catholic?
Yes. So my dad's side of the family is what I was referring to, and that they were super strict. And my mom actually was not practicing any religion.
Okay.
So she did not practice any religion, and the church was what I did with dad every Sunday. But again, he's not the type to shove something down our throats. So we had these steps and we did it, but then at a certain age, we were able to decide for ourselves, and he supports that as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That's good to have like a frame of reference for, your background. So given that your parents were more liberal, would you say that that's where you fall like on the political spectrum as well?
I would say I don't like to categorize myself. I think that some of my values that I say are liberal are because they normally fall under those, the people that are liberal
Or Democrats.
On some things have very strong belief systems regarding a woman's choice, regarding things that I strongly believe in. So that's where I say liberal as kind of an umbrella term because I'm so strict and strong-willed in those viewpoints. So that's where I feel that my liberal nature comes into play because whereas if you say, oh, you're conservative, you can kind of get an ideal of the belief system that someone holds. So technically I would call myself an independent, trying to analyze and study for myself. But again, a lot of those strong viewpoints that I have where I have no wavering on would be tied into a liberal's mindset as well.
And I've had this conversation on previous episodes, I think way back to my first season where I did an episode where I interviewed someone who identifies as a Democrat and someone who identifies as Republican. And back in those episodes, I clarified the difference, like there's a difference between Democrat and Republican and liberal and conservative. Liberal and conservative are ideologies and ways of thinking.
That is so true.
Conservative and Democrat are political parties. But they usually go hand in hand, right? So if you're Republican, Republicans tend to have conservative values.
Exactly.
Democrats tend to have liberal values. And so because they've become so intertwined, it's like you can't say I'm conservative or I'm liberal without people assuming that you're Democrat or Republican, which is fair.
Exactly.
Because most of the time, conservatives are Republican and liberals are Democrats.
Right.
But I actually said this in my last episode. I have a liberal way of thinking because the definition of liberal is open to change, right?
Absolutely.
Conservatives tend to gravitate towards tradition and maintaining what has always worked, things like that.
Yes.
So in my way of thinking, you could say I'm liberal.
Absolutely.
But there's, opinions that I have that fall probably more in alignment with either party, Democrat
for
or
sure.
Republican.
I completely agree with you on that.
And this is one of those things where a lot of people assume that if you're a teacher, a lot of teachers are Democrats or are liberal.
Yep.
So just kind of wanted to get that out of the way at the beginning.
Absolutely.
I'm sure like as we go through things and work through different topics, ideologies will come through and stuff. But I don't like people boxing people into, certain labels or whatever and making assumptions.
Absolutely.
And that's usually not the people that listen to my podcast, as you guys know,
Yes.
are people that are more open-minded. So it's not really, I don't hear from a lot of extremists giving me feedback about my podcast unless like something catches wave in the algorithm and then you see people going crazy in the comments.
Yes.
But that's not my target demographic anyways.
Yes, for sure.
So can you tell me some details about the class that you teach and how you came up with your curriculum? I'm assuming you pulled from some psychology background.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I have my degree in psychology. Through that, I've kind of learned different developmental techniques. And I've studied, childhood through adolescence, transitional times. And that's given me a background of kind of the mindset going into creating a curriculum. So I have a lot of autonomy at this new school. It's not very strict. Again, I teach an elective, so I teach health the first semester, and then I teach a class called social emotional learning the second semester. So we transition, and they're both half a credit. So the students are required to take them before they graduate. So with health, I had another prior health teacher, and he decided that his curriculum was just going to be straight online, and then the kids write in the notebook every single day. He was very quiet, and again, this is how teachers' personality styles and their backgrounds can come into play. So he was very quiet. He wanted it to be very structured, and he didn't want to dive deep into the conversations. And to me, that does a disservice to the students. So I have a completely different mindset when creating a curriculum. So I want to make sure that my students are engaged. There's a mix between collaborative work, and the main point when I'm creating a curriculum is just to have open conversations. So I think we learn the most by the students interacting with each other. So allowing them to talk about their own specific experiences is something that I strongly believe in. So I structure my class every single day. They have a daily question. It's called a quick write question. They will respond on a Google form, and then they'll get the opportunity to talk to someone else in the class about the other students' feedback and what their opinion is. So it can range from, tell me about a time when you had an experience where you were isolated. Again, if we're covering a unit on bullying or mental health. And then they can write as much or as little as they want to, but again, they have that personal experience. And we obviously do icebreaker activities and things to where it's not just like, oh, talk to the person, feel uncomfortable. At that age, you're trying to figure out kind of like how to speak to other people. So again, I structure it in a certain way to where, okay, they can pick their seat the first week and they can start gradual and start slow. And then when designing the curriculum, I just always feel that you need to have mental health and safety at the forefront. So when designing those lessons, again, you have to realize that not every student is going to want to share, and they have the option. They can do certain activities alone, so they can work alone, because I never want the student to feel isolated or to have to talk to other people about something they don't feel comfortable talking about yet. So with health, it's different units. So we have about 7 units throughout the semester. Again, we cover physical health, and then I really stress mental health in my curriculum because I think it's of utmost importance. So I'll do a week on, actually it's about 2 weeks on suicide prevention and mental illness. Again, I think there's such a stigma in society surrounding mental illness, and the only way to eliminate that stigma is to talk about it and to make sure we're able to see that other people are also struggling. And within that, I've had some breakthroughs that give me chills to think about, just within the students, and just seeing them allow themselves to be open and vulnerable. It is truly the most touching experience. So then we'll dive into, again, the physical health component. We'll look at different disease prevention. We'll look at diet, how that can play a role into even mental health and the physical health component. And then we do have sex ed. So about 3 months into the school year, which is a good kind of time frame because at that point you're more comfortable with your students, they're more comfortable with you. Then we'll introduce sex ed. And how it works at my school is the students get a permission slip that they have to take home. So they take it home, they get it signed, the parent says yes or no if they want the student to partake in the curriculum. So how it works is I made my own resources. Again, what I was left with was the bare bones of this is sex, basically. You think of the just cookie cutter like health that we had even in 5th grade. I didn't have a health class in high school. I was not required to take that. So I was only required to take PE. So I had one in 5th grade maybe, and I think one in 8th grade. And again, I didn't learn the ins and outs in the way that I wish I would have learned looking back now. And so what I really try to do with my sex ed curriculum especially is just making sure that the students do not feel judged. So it's not abstinence only. And I tell them that when I'm introducing the topic. I said, I know this is uncomfortable. This is probably the last thing that you want to talk about with your teacher. But I said, we are all human beings and we all have urges and desires. So let's just get that out of the way first. And so it allows them to feel a little bit more at ease. It's all in the approach of the conversation, because it's not just if you do this, you're a bad kid. And you cannot do this. And I'm sure you have experienced this within Catholic school as well. They preach abstinence only. And abstinence doesn't work for everyone. It might work for one person, but it doesn't work for everyone. And the majority of teenagers, I think we should give them the resources and allow them to make their own decisions. And then within that, what ties into that is also my SEL curriculum, so social emotional learning. So what I do and how I structure this curriculum is making sure that they know themselves. They're able to recognize their own emotions and make sense of their emotions. What I really stress is healthy coping strategies. So what works for you when you're feeling overregulated or when you're feeling super overwhelmed? What is a coping strategy that you can do that personally works for you? Instead of just telling them, take 10 deep breaths. Well, maybe breathing exercises for them doesn't work. Again, finding something that is individualized. And I think within our school systems, especially in Nevada, it is just a one-size-fits-all approach. And that is such a disservice to the students. And then with the social component, that is just making sure that they recognize healthy relationships. They're able to resolve conflicts. Conflicts are going to come in high school. We all know how tough it is growing up. So making sure they're able to recognize, okay, is this a healthy environment for me? And if not, can I set a boundary to make it healthy, or do I need to walk away from this situation completely? So that's a little bit of background on what I teach.
Yeah, it's very well-rounded, and it's stuff that is not taught
Absolutely.
in school presently, because I had a private education. It's a little bit unique because it was a Catholic private education.
Mm-hmm.
So they do have the freedom to shape their curriculum differently, but it's shaped from a religious lens, right?
Absolutely.
So I remember my experience with health and sex ed. There was a fifth grade one, and I think it was seventh grade was the second time. So in the fifth grade one, it was just anatomy. So it was what are these parts of your body? What do they do? Mm-hmm. This is what a period is. They may have even separated us by gender.
Yes, I think they did with me as well.
Yeah, I can't remember, but I feel like they did. I did have to have a permission slip.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember learning about it, and I remember being like not knowing the details of what everything was. So it was interesting to me, and I was like, I can't wait to get my period. Yeah. Little did I know.
Oh, yes. Now you're like, oh, my God, I wish I could go back to those days.
Stupid to be excited, but you're 12 or however you're old. What? Fifth grade is 10. 10.
Yeah, it's 10. Uh-huh.
Yeah, so I'm 10 years old thinking I'm going to be a woman and I'm ready. And
yeah.
I would take it back.
Absolutely, in a heartbeat.
But so that was the first one. And then in seventh grade, we started to talk about sex. And it was an abstinence-only video. It was like a VCR that she put in.
Yep.
And that's literally how old it was. It was a VCR.
Oh,
and
for sure.
It was filmed probably in the early 90s. And it was just interviews with couples who had been only with each other and had been married for, I don't even know how long they had been married for, but they had only been with each other. And it was like, this is why you only do this when you're married with somebody. I don't remember all the details. I just remember being like, all right.
Right, and you just write it off. It doesn't really apply to you or appeal to you at that age. Again, you're just watching a boring video about people that had one experience, and you're like, okay, this isn't relevant to me. So I'm just one ear out the other,
And it didn't influence me any more than being in Catholic school for 6 years influenced me to be abstinent. Video didn't help me be abstinent.
Absolutely.
Catholic education didn't help me be abstinent, right?
Yes.
So I think that there's this stigma around teaching sex ed where it's like, do you think that we should teach it? Because if we do, is that going to make kids more sexually promiscuous? Is that going to encourage them to have sex? What is your stance on that? Like, do you think teaching sex ed encourages kids to be sexually promiscuous?
I don't think so at all, in my personal opinion. I think we're giving them the resources. We're telling them, okay, you have a choice to make if it were to come down to this. And then that's why the foundation for me is healthy relationships. So if you are in a relationship or you are with someone that you trust, I think trust is the foundation, in my own personal opinion. So if you do feel that you want to take that step, then you'll know and you'll be prepared and you'll have those resources. So instead of just going into it like, I don't know what's going on, maybe not wearing a condom or being at risk for an STD, there's stigma about STDs as well. And what I teach my students is not everything is as it seems. So within even the STDs, I show them pictures. So the pictures, they're able to see, okay, this is what were to happen to my own body part if I got this, and what are the steps I can take to protect myself against that. And within that, some of my students will even have visible emotional reactions. And they'll say, ew, oh my gosh. And I'll say, okay, look at your reaction right now. Do you think this is open or do you think it's very judgmental? And they'll say, no, I don't want to get that. That's disgusting. And I'll say, have you ever thought about it from a lens of, imagine someone that was in a relationship, they trusted their partner and they got cheated on and they had no idea. And then come to find out that's how they got that STD. You know, I took a human sexuality class in college, and there was a woman, and she ended up getting HIV from a partner who knew he had it, and she had absolutely no idea. She saw his she didn't see his results. That's what I always tell my students, is to get tested and to make sure they show you, you know?
Right.
And even then, there's some times where you can't even control that aspect. And she ended up suing him, and he's in jail now for the experience. Yeah, wow. And that's something that really stuck with me and allowed me to be more open-minded even, and not look at, okay, getting an STD, that doesn't mean you're a gross person. And that's what I tell my students. Like, not every situation is like what it seems to you when you first have that reaction. So let's take a step back. And I think that's what's missing in our society, is just that empathetic nature. Not only like, oh, empathy when it's distance from you, but that ability to be like, this hasn't happened to me, but still, have I thought of all angles of the situation before I quickly judge or quickly react to it?
Right. So I'm trying to think of the other classes that I've had throughout, like in terms of sex education. So I did take a health class in high school my freshman year. I was required to take it at Coronado. And it, again, very basic stuff. Anatomy, it goes more in depth than, you know, whatever you would have had in middle school, but it's pretty much like a chapter on female and male anatomy. And then I took a human sexuality class in college as well. And everything that you are teaching them from what it sounds like in high school is what I learned in college, right?
Good. Yeah.
So, because I did touch on some things with sexuality in my AP psychology class my senior year, but we went in depth with everything in this class in college. And STDs and things like that, I'm pretty sure we touched on them in high school, but it's high level. It's it's like it was the wrestling coach that was teaching the health class. So
absolutely,
you know, it wasn't thorough, and I learned about like specific STDs and things like that once I got to college. And that's when my human sexuality class in college actually, because, you know, you're adults at that point, so you don't have to have permission slips. Right. She gives you the option to opt out of anything that you don't want to watch, or she'll give like trigger warnings if it's things having to do with sexual assault and things like that. But we would watch porn in
absolutely.
class.
That's so interesting, and you can learn a lot, honestly.
Yeah. So we watched, like, I mean, it was an online class. They teach it in person.
Okay.
But it's an online class when I took it, and she would, you know, do like, it would be a live online class. So we would like log on and like watch
be on
teach.
Zoom at the same time.
So we, you know, are just sitting in this room and
just casually watching porn. Yeah, no big deal, for sure.
That's literally what it was. It was a squirting video, and then I can't even remember. Like, we even got so far as to get into like sexual kinks and behaviors and things like that.
Absolutely. Mine did as well.
Birth control, STDs, like sexuality, transgender stuff. Like, it was very, very in depth.
Absolutely.
This is something that we'll get into like the extent to which it should be taught. And I know gender studies is like a whole separate thing.
Yes.
That, I mean, it's kind of coupled under the same umbrella though,
Yes,
right? Because
absolutely.
in my human sexuality class, gender studies was a part of it. So we learned about, people wanting to be called certain pronouns.
Yes.
I actually learned about like brain chemistry in terms of transgender issues back in high school in AP psychology. And so there were very different experiences with what the type of education I received in high school versus in college.
Yes.
And there's pros and cons to both. So I had what I appreciate about my high school experience, even though he, I think, was kind of going out on a limb by including that in the curriculum.
For sure.
It was an AP class, so I think that gave him a little bit more leverage with the curriculum.
Absolutely.
But he was, it's at Coronado.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty conservative school.
Absolutely.
There's a big Mormon population there. It's predominantly white. So that demographic tends to be more conservative, right? So he's already kind of going out on a limb by teaching this. It was very objective, though. So it was, here's the information. Here's what's happening in someone's brain. Here's what happens when you take hormones. We watch like snippets from that show, Jazzy, like.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I don't know the name of it, but she transitioned when she was like 5 or
Yes,
something.
it was on TLC, I think.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so we watched some stuff about that, answered some questions. Very objective, and I appreciate the fact that it was objective.
Yes.
In college, it was very value laden.
Okay.
And it's hard, I get it, because you're kind of you veer into human rights and things of that nature and character. But everything in my human sexuality class was very liberal.
Okay.
It was a very liberal standpoint. I agreed with most of what she's saying.
Right.
There were some times, though, where there were certain things that made me uncomfortable.
Yeah.
That, and I don't get uncomfortable easy.
For sure. That's a lot. That's saying a lot,
I don't have harsh lines. Like, there's very few things that I'm not willing to hear somebody out on.
Yes.
One of the things that I was like, I don't know about this, and I actually emailed her because I'm like, again, I'm independent.
Yes.
More liberal mindset, but there's things where I think, it's pushing it too far. Or I'm not like a cancel culture person. So sometimes I think that the cancel culture stuff can like be pushed to the point where things that should not be okay are becoming okay. So like, for example, there was this section where we were talking about sexual kinks, and it was brief. It wasn't like super in depth. But one of the kinks was, or you know what it was? Is she had us take this like quiz, like this BDSM quiz.
Oh, wow.
Where it was like 150.
What's your preference type of?
It was like a spectrum of like vanilla to whatever.
Super kinky, yeah. Master kink.
Yeah, and there's like different categories or whatever. And the questions on there were asking things like, do you enjoy like dressing up like a toddler and like coloring and wearing diapers or having binkies on and like things like that, right?
Yeah.
Which I get it. It can be indicative of a much larger issue from childhood, but that nothing with kids should be sexualized.
Completely agree.
Not that kids don't have, sexual thoughts.
Right.
Like as
That's
a
not to
child,
say.
you do. It's natural.
Exactly.
Like they explore their bodies. That's different.
Yes,
You know what I mean? It's
completely
okay to
agree.
encourage kids. Like, it's okay to have these thoughts.
Yeah.
But to sexualize anything in a childlike nature made me uncomfortable.
Oh, for sure.
And so when there were questions on this quiz about, about diapers or, like, do you like to role play in this way? I'm like, that
is a whole other conversation.
That's something else.
For
and
sure.
that's something that I don't think should be normalized or
Ever.
accepted as a sexual kink.
No.
That's something they need to go to therapy for.
I could not agree with you more, Destiny.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that's when I was like, okay, this is very value laden. Like this is the floodgates are open right now, and I'm not comfortable with that. So I like had sent her an email and said, I'm feeling some type of way about this question, and
Yes.
she went back and forth with me a little bit, and she was very understanding.
Okay.
But it wasn't like the answer that I was looking for from a teacher where it's like, you're right, this is not okay.
Yeah.
it didn't like rub me the wrong way, but I remember like being like, well, that's not exactly what I meant, but okay, I guess we'll just leave it be.
Right.
You know? So it's hard because how do you manage that line? Like of how much you teach, when you teach it, at what age should we separate it from basic anatomy and start going into sex? Because, you know, kids, like with the onset of the internet and the access they have to things at their fingertips on smartphones, you know, it's different from when we grew up.
Yes,
right? Like
absolutely.
This is a new generation
It completely is.
That we're dealing with. I have a 15-year-old brother. He's had an iPad in his hand since he was 2. So it's like by the time they're 9, they can Google fucking porn.
Exactly.
And there's no way, if you have more like laissez-faire parents that are not super involved or not, you know, monitoring everything that they're doing, like, and just being around your peers who are also doing those things and have access to that stuff, like, oh, look what I found. They're going to be exposed to it, you know, and like what you can't shelter them from it as much as you try. So at what age? You know, and there is some innocence associated with childhood. Yeah. So at what age do you think, you know, okay, this is when we teach about anatomy. This is when we actually start talking about sex. This is when we start talking about, you know, because like sexual kinks and stuff like that, I don't think a 14-year-old is handling that information well.
No, not by any means.
You know, like that might not be necessary.
I completely agree with you.
In college, when you're an adult and you might be exploring those things, that's different.
Yes.
But there could be stages to introduce this stuff. So what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I completely agree with you in that it should be staged. And I think this all comes back to we need to do a better job of vetting our teachers, because our teachers should have a very strong background in psychology, in looking at child development and looking at the brain, how the brain works, at what age you're hitting, again, those milestones where your body is changing. And then we need to structure our curriculum and our lessons based upon that. So I think it's very easy for someone to just be like, oh, in elementary school, we're going to have anatomy. And then in middle school, we're going to have anatomy plus like a few other concepts, but we're not going to get into like sex with another partner. We're just going to get into abstinence only. And it's like, that is the issue, I think, is that we're not looking at the full picture. And as you touched on, looking at the accessibility to the internet, these kids are starting younger and younger. And I've had experiences where I've heard of students, you know, losing their virginity at very young ages. That was not really a thing. I didn't even know what a blowjob was when I was in 7th grade, you know, and I had to go to Google. And so it's like you can structure it in a very specific way, in that you're looking at, okay, times are changing and it might be starting earlier. Again, but we don't have to bring into it sexual kinks, or we don't have to push okay, this is the time. So if you don't feel this way, and basically you stated it perfectly, then you're going to be like an outcast. Or if you don't try this, then you're going to be left behind, you know? So I think it does need to be scaled, but I think also we need to make sure our teachers are aware of the psychological background and just the brain dynamic that's happening to these students and what they're going to be experiencing. So that would be my answer to that question. And just noting on that other question of how I structure my curriculum, I just had another thought. So basically in high school, what I do is, I told you I'm very big on collaborative learning. So I have game shows. They have this one game show called The Price is Right. So on this game show, what they do is they get into groups, and we have all these baby items that I show on a PowerPoint, and they have to guess what price it would be for the baby item. And they get all into it. Even students that I didn't think would be engaged are completely invested. And any student loves competition at that age. You know, they always want to win. They always want to be right. And so they get into it. And then the next day, what I do is I have them do a complete baby cost calculator. So this is up until the baby leaves for college. I mean, not the baby, the kid leaves for college. Yeah. When they're 18 years old, what is the cost associated with that? And I had one student come to me and they're like, I don't need a baby carrier. I'm going to carry my baby in a bag because it is way too expensive for X, Y, and Z. But allowing them to see the real life, not just, oh, I think my partner's attractive. And could you imagine, you know, we see on Instagram all these like baby pages for like certain kids that look a certain way. And if your kid looks like this, you can make them an Instagram page and they'll be a sensation. And it's like, what is going on there? What is happening, you know? And it's not just a doll that you can hold and will get 1 million views and you can be famous off of it. There are so many things that you don't think about when you don't have a baby and then when the baby comes, especially if you're going to be a teen parent, that I want to make sure my students are very aware of. This is the reality of it. And I even asked my school, they actually said no, but I asked if we could have the babies that they carry and they have to take care of. They take care of them, I think, for a week. There's a program where the student will carry the baby around for about a week, and the baby cries, the baby needs to be changed, it needs to be fed, to fully see, okay, this is the real life experience of what having a child is. So I think if we structure in that way, it allows them to see more fully what the dynamic would be, and then they can have that split second where they're like, you know what, maybe I should use a condom, or you know what, maybe I'm not ready for this at this point in time in my life.
Yeah. What is the demographic at your school? Is it, because, there's some schools, you said you taught in North Las Vegas,
Definitely.
Right? The rate of teen pregnancy up there is going to be higher.
Yes.
Than somewhere like Coronado. So what is the demographic of your school? Like, is that an issue that you run into, or is that
So
not
we've
uncommon?
had 2 girls that have become pregnant and then one that has become a father. So the reason why my school said, oh, no, is because we don't have a high rate. But I said, okay, but we still need to prevent that from happening. And I think we as a culture are so individualistic in that if it doesn't happen to you or someone close to you, then you're like, it doesn't matter. It's not an issue. When in reality, let's look at these 3 kids and their lives have been completely changed and completely altered. And if we could have done more, then we should have done more. If we could have provided resources, then we should have provided those resources. So the lens I look at it as is every student is valuable. Just because they're not the majority, it's not going to be that they don't matter or we can just brush it to the side. Because if it happened to your kid or it happened to your best friend, then you have a different mindset, I believe, in my own opinion.
Well, I would think if it's happening at all.
Exactly.
It's something,
it should.
Yeah. Like I could see, I guess, more of an argument if there were no pregnancies at all across the school and they're like, well, there's just not a need. But if there are teenagers who are becoming pregnant, they're around other teenagers.
For sure.
So, and that's when they're very malleable at that age. So if they see people their age, their peers at their school who are doing this, then that could become normalized.
For sure.
Right? And, I'm not trying to put judgments on teen moms or anything, but that's not ideal.
Not by any means.
So yeah, that surprises me that they were not open to something like that.
Yes.
Shifting gears here a little bit, we had mentioned gender studies and how that's a little bit different from sex ed altogether. To what extent do you think – so let me preface there's a lot of people that don't know the difference between gender and sex. So this is something that I learned. Maybe we touched on it in high school. Definitely got more in depth in college. So I took I have a communications degree.
Okay.
I took a gender communication course where it was basically learning the difference between sex and gender, and then also the differences between how males and females tend to communicate.
Oh, wow.
And then also in my human sexuality class, we got into pronouns and things like that. So I have my own beliefs about this.
Right.
So the difference by definition, and this is what some people don't understand or don't agree that there should be a difference, is that by definition, sex is how you're born.
Yes.
Like with a penis or a vagina.
Yep.
And then there's also intersex, where sometimes there are
both.
people that are born with both genitalia.
Yep.
Which makes it confusing because there's, I can't remember the specifics of like which chromosome they have or whatever, but their hormones are messed up, and then it's basically at birth parents are having to pick which one they're gonna keep. That's sex, right? Like your biological body parts. The definition of gender is how you display. It's like a behavior, how you act,
feel, how you perceive
how you dress.
it. Yes, for sure.
So it's this socially constructed thing, right? Like I agree, gender is socially constructed.
Yes.
I just don't, this is veering into controversial territory, but it's a label, right?
Yes,
so
it
it's
is
like
absolutely a label.
there's this thing called being androgynous, right? Which is you have personality traits and behaviors of both genders.
Exactly.
I have an androgynous personality, right? So I grew up in a household where my mom has from what I learned in school, by how males communicate versus how females communicate. My mom communicates in a masculine way.
Okay.
My dad can communicate in feminine ways sometimes, right? So I have this blended personality where it's like, and I grew up with brothers too.
Absolutely.
Right? So I enjoy being feminine. I enjoy being pretty and getting dressed up and displaying myself in that way. I also went through a tomboy phase.
Oh, for sure.
And I also communicate in a way that is traditionally more masculine,
Yes.
right? That if we're going by definition, like by gender, right? Like I wouldn't be labeled a woman by gender,
right?
If we're going based off of behavior, right? Like I would be labeled whatever and androgynous, right? Like I'm not going to identify myself based on my behaviors or my personality. I'm just going to say, I'm a woman because that's what I have down there.
Yeah.
And how I act might be masculine, but this is how I feel.
Yeah, how you feel about
inside.
Yourself, for sure.
So I think that it gets sticky because I personally don't see the benefit in creating multiple different pronouns.
Okay.
So
yes.
I will call you whatever you want. It
Yes.
doesn't hurt me. It doesn't bring harm to me.
Yes.
If you want me to call you whatever,
Yes.
that's fine.
Yes.
It's just I ask for patience then from whoever it is.
It is
that
very
you may
challenging.
my brain may not see you as that right away.
It is
so
very
I
challenging.
may slip up and I may
Yes.
refer to you as this or refer to you as that.
Absolutely.
And I also just don't think that I don't know. Let me ask your opinion first on
absolutely.
the extent to which gender studies should be taught in class. So I'm not on my soapbox here.
Yes. So what I feel is, again, I'm always looking at it from the one student whose life it could save. So my mindset is going to be very different in that they don't cover that in our standards-based curriculum. So we have a set of standards that we're supposed to look at. And in those set of standards, it does not even cover like homosexuality in those. So looking at that, we're not technically, I don't want to say supposed to teach that, but we actually, when looking at the standards, aren't. And I've had parents email me before sex ed starts, and they've said, are you covering any gender studies? And so what I'll email back is I'll say, the curriculum does not cover any gender studies in my curriculum. Now, when we're diving into gender studies, I do mention it to my students. And what I do is I give them an anonymous question box. So if they have any questions, they can anonymously type in the questions, and then I will go through and I'll cover the questions. Kids are naturally going to be curious. Maybe there's a student that wants to have a private conversation about it. So again, leaving that line of conversation open is going to be the most important thing. I think the worst thing we can do as a society is just say, don't talk about that, or, oh, it's not important. So to one student, it might be very valid, and that just comes down to making sure that you portray yourself as a safe zone for the student. So my own personal beliefs is I feel that I could teach it, but I don't know if the general population that are health teachers or are teaching an SEL class could teach it in a way that is unbiased. In a way that says, you know what, these people exist and they have feelings, and let's try and validate their feelings, but let's also understand that we don't have to be the same as them, and that just comes down to a mutual level of respect, and that's what you cultivate in your classroom. Making sure you have a foundation of respect, of empathy, of understanding is going to be the most important key component. So again, I feel comfortable teaching gender studies. When I get a question, I will address it. I think the worst thing, again, that we can do is not addressing it or saying that, you know what, this doesn't matter or this isn't relevant to my own viewpoint. And again, that's why I value the podcast that you do, because you are talking about these controversial issues. Now, my own personal viewpoints. I will never forget, I had a student when I was looking at my roster, and normally it says M or F for male or female, and they had an X there. And so I was like, that's interesting. I don't know a lot about it. And so that's unidentified. So they don't want to be marked as either male or female. with the pronoun dynamic, that specific person, I'll give them a packet the first day, and it's a get to know you survey. So I'll say, hey, is there anything that I need to know? Again, a lot of students will be comfortable writing that they have social anxiety or they need to sit in a certain place in the room. They'll be comfortable writing that instead of me just asking like, hey, nice to meet you. You know, can you tell me about your life story, or are there any things that are relevant to your learning in the classroom? So that's a way for me to get to know. And this specific student said, I go by they, them. Now, in my mind, you know how they'll say, oh, it's just a phase that they're going through. I do think that there is some truth to the pronoun phase. I know that Demi Lovato was someone that switched her pronouns and then switched back and then was like, you know what, this is all too much. Again, my mindset, I'm going to look at it like if this person feels that this is necessary to promote their mental health, and if being called they, them, I will try. Again, just like you were saying. But Destiny, I can't tell you the amount of times that I have been trying to refer to another student who classifies themselves as they, them, and said, oh, she did this, or oh, she, and it's very hard. But I will say that kids are I think a lot more forgiving than we give them credit for. So they're not saying, if you don't do this, then I'm offended and I will never talk to you again. They don't almost have that same mindset of cancel culture that I think we as adults portray, or we have, especially in our day and age. So I think they're like, hey, I would prefer this, but if you don't, it's okay. And you're not going to ruin a relationship because of it. Mm-hmm. So I think it does take time to adjust to. Again, I'm looking at it from the mindset of if this makes their life easier and if I can try, then I should. Because what bearing does it have on my life? It's not affecting me at all. I'm still living the way I'm going to live. But calling you they, them, if it makes you more comfortable and more safe, again, the key dynamic in a classroom is going to be that safety component. So those are my own personal viewpoints. Again, I don't strongly believe in the pronoun argument that we should, have all these. And it's very confusing when you're in the middle of a story and it almost, it doesn't disrupt the dynamic. But again, then you're like, oh my God, you freeze up and you're super awkward about it. And you're like, oh, shoot, I just called them. Mm-hmm. Or I called the person, the wrong one. I get uncomfortable, or not uncomfortable. I get stumbling on my words when I look at dynamics like that and how you have to take that extra step. But again, it's going to be just that component of what makes them feel safe and how can I allow another person to feel safe. Right.
And I think that I look at it from a communications perspective, which is, and, I don't have any type of I actually think they took gender dysphoria out of the DSM-5.
Yes, they did.
So that's like an outdated term now or whatever. But, for lack of a better term, like confusion or uncertainty about what gender they feel like they are on the inside, right? Like I've never experienced that.
For sure.
So I can't speak on that. I can speak on it from a communications perspective. And a desire for there to be more unity around the world and less division and less polarization.
For sure.
And I look at it from the power that words have in our way of thinking. Like we process things with words. We categorize things with words. Language is so powerful in the way that we think, right? Like your rhetoric matters. The things that you say directly influence someone's way of thinking. That's what I spent 4 years studying in school.
Yes.
Right? And that's why it's so dangerous to have people in power that use violent rhetoric or things that they might not be saying outright, but they have implications.
Absolutely.
And people will translate it a certain way. Like it matters, right? The words you use matter. So when you create more words, more labels, right, for gender, for how you portray yourself, that is more division. That's a way of saying, this is what makes me different from you, which isn't inherently a bad thing.
Right.
But with this particular thing, it gets messy because it's like, when does it stop?
Yes,
because
when do you draw the line?
Really, we're talking about personality here.
For
right?
sure.
Like your interests, your behaviors, the way that you communicate. That's personality. And there's so many different types.
Yes.
So it's like, how do you classify me then, right? Like I am feminine, I'm a female,
For sure.
but I communicate in a masculine way, right? Which is, it can be non-verbally, it can be verbally. I take up space when I talk. I use my hands a lot. I'm a hand talker. The way that I sit, I tend to sit with, my legs more open or with my arms spread out, which is a more masculine way of communicating. Sometimes that's what you have to do as a female to earn respect from other people in the room. Because for whatever reason, male dominant behaviors have been associated with power and confidence and things like that. So, if I'm communicating in a way that's masculine, then what's my personality? Is my gender not she, my pronouns not she, her? Because I talk more like my brother than I do like my peers, And so that's the only thing that I have hesitations about, is because we're creating more labels and more division instead of seeing what we have in common, which I don't want that to sound ignorant, right? Because it's I understand the struggle. I can have empathy for people that are struggling. But I look at that and I think, is this really the way to solve that? And again, I will still call you whatever you want to be called.
And I think there's a difference between people that say that they're transgender and physically feel like they're in the wrong body, and then people that are just wanting to be classified as a certain pronoun type because, maybe all of their group of friends feel like, they're just free spirits, and they're young kids and they're going along with those trends. And I actually listened to a very interesting senior presentation this year. And he was talking about how us labeling mental health disorders among youth can be problematic. And basically his whole mindset and his whole moral of his presentation was that they will log on to TikTok. They'll see, I'm depressed. I'm anxious. They'll self-classify when in reality they might not fit into that label. So fit into that little box that you were touching on. So I think, to your point of labeling, it can do a disservice. And sometimes it's not always that. What I tell my students, especially with mental health, is say that you're feeling depressed. Say that I'm feeling depressed. Don't say I'm depressed. Or wait, let me think about this.
There's a way to separate it from you.
Yes, so don't attach your identity to the feeling, the temporary feeling that you might experience. So that's what I always try and tell my students is, let's not just slap a label. And I think a lot of medical professionals as well will slap a label. They'll not look at the individual person. They'll not look at the holistic component. What's your diet? What's your exercise? How do you cope with your stress? And they'll just slap that on them and say, okay, this is what it is, and take some pills. And that's not going to benefit them in the long run. In a healthy lifestyle, holistically, that's not going to be beneficial.
Yeah, that could be a whole episode.
For sure, yes.
That reminds me, I want to do an episode on pharmaceuticals.
Absolutely.
So thank you for that.
Yes, of course.
We'll touch on that probably at a later date.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, so when you're teaching, these things have stigmas attached to them. Mental health, gender studies, sex ed, it's things that are inherently value-laden. So how, as an educator, do you remain objective in the classroom while you're teaching potentially contentious issues? What strategies do you use to prevent your personal opinions from influencing your teachings too much?
Yeah, that is a very loaded question, I would say. But again, having the background that I have in psychology and the degree that I have, and just being able to work with kids, you develop a way to talk about these topics without influencing in a way that oversteps. So I am not their parent. I'm not trying to instill a certain belief system into them. And if I always keep that in the back of my mind when I'm creating these assignments, it helps me. Or I'm creating these opportunities for them to talk amongst themselves. So if I say, hey, we're going to cover this topic, there might be some of you that view it this way. There might be some of you that view it this way, and that's okay. You might have family dynamics that explore it in this manner. And again, just touching on it before, setting that foundation of this is the belief system that could happen is going to be very important in being unbiased myself. So allowing them to see that, okay, these different belief systems exist and I'm covering all of them and touching on all of them before we get into it, again, I don't have too much pushback of, well, how do you feel about this? Because I'm stating it in a very objective way. So their comments, the majority of questions I get are their own inputs and their experiences that they want to talk about. And I think that's when I know, okay, I've executed a lesson very objectively because I'm not getting feedback on, well, what do you think about this? Instead, they're internally reflecting and they're saying, oh, how does this apply to me? And I think that goes back to what you stated in high school, how you were watching this abstinence video and it did nothing for you. Again, if you try and structure it in a way that the kids are going to see themselves within the lesson, and maybe not now, maybe when they face a really hard dynamic later down the road, maybe when they get into college, they get their first job. But again, allowing them to see, okay, this little box is not going to be your long-term reality, and you're going to have experiences that maybe not now, but maybe in the future that you have to face and deal with. I hope that you would remember these lessons and these strategies, again, from an unbiased perspective and just internally looking rather than turning outward.
Right, and I think what you're describing is just encouraging critical thinking.
Exactly.
Right? So, like, not
Yes.
shutting them down when they have an alternative perspective. I
sure.
had a teacher, and because in higher education in college, depending on what college you go to, but most of academia is more liberal.
Yes.
So I've had different teachers where you can sense, like they can feel it from
Yes.
you. They know, even in high school, they know if you feel a certain type of way because, teachers are human beings too.
For sure.
So they have opinions, they have beliefs. I've had multiple teachers who make comments about, certain politicians or things like that, and
Yes.
you make a mental note. I had one teacher here at UNLV. I learned the most from her.
Okay.
Like she was not a popular teacher.
Okay.
There were plenty of people that wrote very negative reviews about her. I see where they're coming from because she was super opinionated and very liberal, very Democrat, sometimes to the point where she would make men uncomfortable in the classroom.
Yeah.
The way that she taught was very easily absorbable. My brain just sucked in all of that information really, really well. So I thought she was a great teacher because I learned so much from her. But I could recognize in her that there was extreme bias, right?
Yes.
And so you would see kids, which was great. Like I didn't expect it, but you would see people in class that would raise their hand, me included, and try to kind of challenge some of the stuff that she was saying.
Yes.
And she didn't receive it well,
Ooh,
and that's when you can kind of tell and be like, you know what? I'm going to take this with a grain of salt because
for sure
you can tell, this is what's
it's
coming
so
from a
skewed.
textbook.
Exactly.
And this is what's coming from you.
Yes, and that's what I try to do is I observe how are my students taking this? And I'll never forget one of my students raised their hands just in the middle of them being done with their assignments in the middle of class, and they're like, Miss Silva, are you T or B? And I'm like, T or B? What are you talking about? And they're like, T or B. And I was like, what do you mean by that? I need more context, especially from a high school student. I have no idea what that means. And another student was like, they're asking if you're Trump or Biden. And I said, oh, I'm not talking about my political viewpoints. And so I just stated that fact. And then another student, I overheard them and they were like, oh, she's in the middle. Like she would never pick a side. And I thought in my head, wow, because I do have strong viewpoints about politicians in general, but the students were not able to recognize that. And I said, okay, that makes me feel good hearing that and not me having to prompt them, how do you think your teacher feels? That was a defining moment for me to always recognize that when I'm creating that curriculum myself.
Do you believe that there is a place for personal beliefs in the classroom, and to what extent?
Ooh,
or do you think it's completely separate?
That is a very good question. I mean, that does get into the value-based argument, though, because values that I hold true to myself that I think we should all display, again, in my mind, they're defined as good. So empathy, respect, but again, they're subjective terms. So in my viewpoints, again, I have personal beliefs of, okay, let's not bully one another, that I take very seriously. But I have to break that down for my students. And when we're going over our class norms, and this is something that I learned from Teach for America. They told us, don't use ambiguous terms like respect. Define what that looks like in practice. So I say, okay, when we're dealing with conversation, how can we communicate in a healthy way and in a healthy manner? So I think within that realm, my personal belief systems regarding values will come into play, but not so much, again, how I feel in the choices that I make or the choices I decide to live out on a daily basis, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But I will say, like, certain lifestyle factors, I will try to encourage them, again, to exercise, to eat healthy, to do certain things.
Things that are universally good.
Exactly, universally good. But again, someone could come at me and say, okay, that's your definition of good. Right. You know, and I want to live a certain way. But again, I'm always open to having that conversation, and that's where I think true learning and growth is going to come from.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Have you ever had negative interactions with parents because they didn't agree with what you were teaching or how you were teaching? Or
Yes, I absolutely have. So when I was at Pinecrest, I was teaching English, and I gave them an article from a school-approved website. It was, I can't even remember the name. It was some platform that we used, one of the platforms that had a bunch of educational articles. And the article was about spiders. And the first sentence in the article said something to the nature of, spiders are very popular during Halloween time in America. And I got a parent email, and they said, my student doesn't celebrate Halloween. Why are you teaching them about Halloween? And I don't feel comfortable with them. Can you provide an alternative assignment? And that same parent, I had them read something from President Obama. It was about why school and education is going to be beneficial for the long run. And he essentially was saying, whatever route you take, like, you want to make sure you can learn and develop a love of learning. So again, not even saying like you need to go to college, you need to do X, Y, and Z. And that same parent ended up emailing me again and saying, hey, I don't feel comfortable with my student. And at that point, in my own personal opinion, you need to look at homeschooling your student, because you have certain belief systems. But again, in my own viewpoints, and I will share them, I don't feel that homeschool is beneficial because the students are not interacting with people other than their own background. So again, as we touched on, when they get out into the real world and they're faced with someone who has completely different views, again, that's where hate crimes can happen. That's where they're faced with all these negative viewpoints about certain groups, because growing up, they were told this is the way we think. And instead of saying, oh, you can think X, Y, and Z, you can practice X, Y, and Z, and you're able to take that accountability and that responsibility for yourself, they're taught this is the ideal and this is the only way. So I've had those interactions. Again, I try and be respectful, and I say, you know what, I can provide an alternative assignment. Me as a teacher, that's my job to do. You know, I will make it work and provide that alternative assignment. But again, I think there's bigger issues there, and you need to really assess, should I be sending my student to a public school?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So what motivates you to keep teaching when you guys are underpaid and you have angry parents and you go underappreciated?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for validating that as well, because a lot of people just say you get summers off and you're lucky. But seeing a student who has low self-worth and looking at their growth over the course of just even 9 months is truly the most rewarding feeling. And I was actually bullied growing up. So I had a terrible school experience growing up. I mean, I don't want to say terrible. It could have been worse. You know, I was provided for. I had an education, which I'm grateful for. But the word dynamic, just hearing those words from certain groups and knowing that I was bullied so heavily, I want to make sure that there is none of that in my classroom. One of my students told me, "You're the only teacher that cares about bullying." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And she's like, "You are so strict about what people say." I say, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. And then my students mock me. Like, they're like, "Oh, Miss Silva said if you don't have anything nice to say," even if they're just messing with their friends. But at least I can control in my classroom, I can control, okay, they're not doing that or engaging it, and maybe they'll take a step back, and maybe they'll be a little bit kinder or a little more empathetic next time they're dealing with a situation. So again, seeing the transformation, and especially at the school I taught at in North Las Vegas, I ended up having to leave. My mom got sick and I was her caregiver, so I was only there temporarily. I was there for about 4 months, and I started this program called Feel Good Fridays. So I would have them do journals and self-reflection activities where they would write positive qualities about themselves. And Destiny, I'm not kidding you, the first Feel Good Friday we did, over 75% of my class, I'd say, said, I don't know one positive aspect about myself.
I just got
And I
chills
said,
because
yes.
that's so sad.
So sad, especially being in 7th grade. You think, oh, I'm the king of this place. You know, you're finding your own, you're developing into yourself, and they could not name one positive quality about themselves. And then at the end of the 4th month, they were naming them and also naming them for other people. And it makes me emotional to think about. So it gives me chills knowing that these little activities can really influence them. And that's what keeps me going. For sure.
Have you seen the movie Freedom Writers?
My favorite. Yes, I adore that movie.
You sound like her. You sound like you're doing great things. So,
I appreciate it so much.
Is there anything that you wanted to cover that I didn't already address?
No, that's pretty much
okay.
it. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for all that you do.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for your time, sharing your experience. I know it's not easy to be the person educating like the next generation of people who are going to be leading and responsible for Earth and everything going on. So thank you. If no one's told you, thank you.
Of course. Thank you so much.
Yeah. If you guys would like to continue this conversation with Madisen, I will have her contact information available on my social media platforms, including YouTube. And I will see you all again in 2 weeks to talk more elephants.